Okay, hi guys, this is the first in what might prove to be a series of revision aid recordings on Yeats's poetry and on the set texts, if we think they're helpful. I'm going to go through my thoughts on the wild swans at Coole today. I'm not going to do it like a commentary in the sense that you'll be doing it in 8 minutes with 2 minutes of questions. I'm going to take slightly longer than that, and I'm going to explain a little bit what I'm doing as I go. The idea being that you can get a sense of how I approach this task, how I talk about the poem. You can note down any ideas, you can note down any wordings, you can also think about the way that I talk about the ideas and the way, hopefully, that I structure what I'm doing as I go, and I'll be explaining what I'm doing as well as doing it. So the first thing I'll do if I get the poem is to annotate it thoroughly as I read. So on your first read you can already be starting to highlight or underline or put rings around features that you remember being significant, at the same time as refreshing your memory as to the meanings of the poem. You'll also want to, when you come to the end, maybe of your first or your second read of it, jot down what you're going to say as your conceptual overview, as your thesis statement, if you like, about the poem. So if you're wanting to write down what the poem's about and what its main features are. So if I was doing that for the Wild Swans at Coole, I might start off by saying that, in my opinion, it is a poem about the changes that come with ageing and the passage of time. Also about the beauty and inspiration that can be found in the contemplation of the natural world and the landscape, both of which are themes that are significant in Yeats's work in other areas. I might say that some of the main features of it are images of the natural world, particularly in the treatment of the swans and their habitat. Another main feature of it, I would say, is a sense of contemplation, a sense of reflection, which we see elsewhere in Yeats's work on what it is to grow older and encounter the changes that one finds in life as one grows older. And also, I think one of the features that I would identify in this poem is the richness of the sound patterning, the way that Yeats has very carefully and delicately constructed a sound landscape, if you like, to match the beauty of the natural landscape. And this extends to examples of alliteration and assonance, and also in the structure of the lines, in the way that he's using the lines. And I might start there. That might be a place to start my commentary. So if I'm going to be talking about those things, I might start with the structure and point out that the rhyme scheme follows loosely a ballad form in the quatrain part of each stanza. So the first 4 lines have a B, C, B structure, with then a D rhyme following that. This gives the impression of a ballad of simplicity, of musicality, that idea that ballads come from simple and elemental folk stories about everyday things, everyday stories, but completed with a rhyming couplet that has a stronger sense of finality. The poem in this way presents an air of simplicity and an air of stillness, if you like, something that's quite aesthetically pleasing, quite aesthetically whole and unified. But as ever with Yeats, this is something that is challenged and questioned as you look in more detail at the way that he constructs his poetry. So we have an artifice of simplicity and actually something very complex happening underneath. So in terms of the structure of the poem, it begins with Yeats describing, or rather Yeats' speaker describing, an autumn scene in which he is observing swans on a lake. He then goes on to describe how he has regularly counted and seen these swans in the same location, Coole Park, which is the place that his friend Lady Gregory lived and which he visited regularly. In the middle of the poem, there's a turning point when, having seen the birds fly into the air, he acknowledges how everything has changed since the first time he saw those birds in Coole Park. And he goes on to talk about how life has become more, I suppose, more melancholic is the impression that one gets, because he describes how previously he trod with a lighter tread, implying that now things are heavier. And when he talks about the swans being unwearied, I think I infer that in the second part of the poem he's talking about a change where he has become more wearied. The poem concludes with him wondering where the swans will go when someday he wakes to find that they're no longer there, bringing a sense of abandonment, perhaps, a permanent change, maybe even death. The ending, as often with Yeats, ending on a question, is somewhat ambiguous. So going stanza by stanza, and I would, I think, move chronologically through the poem as I have encouraged you to do, but not tracking in the sense of not just spotting features and then moving on without putting them in the context of either the key themes of the poem or the main features. So not tracking in the sense of identifying features but not explaining what they're doing there, but moving chronologically so it enables you to comment on structure as you go. In the first stanza we get this wonderful image of the autumn evening. Beauty in the first line suggesting a scene that is aesthetically pleasing, featuring the woodland paths. A combination of woodland and autumn would lead us to kind of imagine a scene with all the colours of autumn. Curiously, the woodland paths are dry. Dry is contrasted with water, the twilight water in the following line, in line 3. So there's a sort of a sense of unexpected dryness in there, given that the water is brimming among the stones. It suggests that there has been rainfall, or that there's no shortage of water. It's certainly not a drought, but we have this contrasting dryness. Maybe all is not quite well. The twilight is described as mirroring a still sky. So under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. It's an interesting line. The sense of mirroring, the sense of reflection, is something that metaphorically we get later in the poem when he reflects on the passage of time. And I think in the way that he's constructed that line, mirrors a still sky, we have the assonance of mirrors a still, so the idea of the reflected eye sound, and then obviously the alliteration of still sky. So we have those two pairings, mirrors, still, still and sky. The words chime together when you read them. And that sense of pairing is something that becomes more important as we go on. But swans obviously are creatures that mate for life, and we're used to the concept of swans in pairs, lifelong mating pairs. And this is really where we arrive at the end of that stanza, the 9 and 50 swans that he counts. 9 and 50, it's an incomplete number. Something seems wrong here, that there's one missing. It's quite a specific count as well, the idea of quite a laborious effort to count all those swans, and we arrive at the fact that one is missing, and the stanza is end stopped with a full stop, as all of them are. So we have this sense of finality with the rhyming couplet that finishes the stanza and the full stop. There's no enjambment here. But yet there's a sense of a lack of completion. This is partly to do with this idea of 9 and 50. It's also, I would say, to do with the variation in the line lengths. So the pairings of lines are uneven in the couplet. We have a 5-syllable followed by a 3-syllable line. We've got a pentameter followed by a trimeter, and that's the standard with those couplets. Again, on the one hand, Yeats is giving us a sense of simplicity and completion with this very predictable rhyme and rhythmical structure, but he's also working very cleverly against that in that variation of line length. Yeats goes on to explain in the second stanza how he has come to encounter these swans. So he talks about the 19th autumn having come upon him since he first counted them. 19th autumn, we've got the sense of autumn repeated from the first line of the first stanza in the first line of the second stanza. Autumn is clearly an important theme, and that with the sense of October. an autumnal season, twilight, the idea of gathering darkness, growing darkness, stillness as well. Twilight is often thought of as a quiet, still time of day, and we have the still sky being referred to. His 19th autumn has come upon him. My 19th autumn has come upon me. This is aging, this is him growing old, but it's also a sense that time has crept up on him. Autumn has come upon him, it's personified there. Perhaps it surprised him. Come upon me also maybe suggests some kind of supernatural force that has almost enchanted him in some way. It's an interesting image. Since first I made my count. He then describes how, before he'd finished counting them, in this particular instance, the instance that he's writing about, before he'd finished counting them, I saw, before I had well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings. So there's a real sense of energy and action here, which he comes back to in the penultimate stanza. But again, he's using, I think, that metrical structure with that quite truncated three-syllable line in the fourth line of the stanza, all suddenly mount, particularly here as it's, sorry, not three-syllable, 3 feet, the trimetrical line. Elsewhere in the poem, that may have 6 syllables, as in stanzas 3, 4, and 5, but in stanzas 1 and 2 it only has 5 syllables. So again, we've got this sense of unevenness, of slight unrest almost. So when we hear about the birds suddenly taking to the sky in line 4 of the second stanza, I think the fact that all suddenly mount is a very abrupt line. It's missing a syllable, it's not punctuated, it runs straight on into the fifth line, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings. We have a sense of the suddenness of the birds flying into the air before he's able to finish counting them. The great wheeling and broken rings, we have a sense of a cycle there. We have the sense of the birds flying in circles above his head, but also maybe in the sense of the wheels of time turning in a way that's disrupted. Broken rings. So broken rings is the idea of maybe a cycle that has been interrupted or will be interrupted. Rings often signify eternity, and we have a sense of a rupture in that eternity. Clamorous wings as well, I think, is an interesting word. Clamorous, obviously giving a sense of the tremendous noise that the birds make when they take off into the sky, but clamour also a sense of a very disruptive noise. Looking at the birds in stanza 3, he describes how his heart is sore, using a synecdoche to substitute the heart for himself or for his broader emotional experience. And it's interesting because that synecdoche is then used in the penultimate stanza for the swans. Their hearts have not grown old. So we're starting to see here an association between Yeats and the swans, the sense that he identifies with them in some sense. He says that everything has changed. This is where the turning point comes in the middle of stanza 3. So as close to the middle of the poem as you can find, we have this sense that all's changed since I hearing at twilight, the first time on the shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head trod with a lighter tread. So there's lots going on there. Again, we have a sense of pairings in the bell beat, the assonance of those plosive B's. The bell beat of their wings above my head calls to mind the sound of the wings, and hearing birds' wings, there's often a percussive quality to it. So the wings hitting the air, but quite often there's a note there as well. There's a more resonant sound that maybe is more like a bell. So we have the sense of the birds flying and the noise they make again, this clamour, this loud noise that they make when they fly, but also the bell beats. The two bees sort of seem to meter out the time quite clearly with those quite heavy sounds. And the bell could be about time passing. It could also be maybe funeral bells tolling. So this sense of time passing towards death, I guess, is implied in that. The bell beat of their wings above my head trod with a lighter tread. So here we have the sense that things were better before, that he experienced more optimism or more lightness in his thinking. And this is coming out of, again, the natural world. This is Yeats musing on these creatures, musing on the autumn evening, and thinking about his own situation in life, identifying very much with the natural world and learning lessons from the natural world, drawing strength even from the natural world as he faces his doubts. He contrasts his own perhaps heavier mood with the birds. And we get a real image now in the penultimate stanza of their vitality, of their activity and their energy. He describes how they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. This idea of the birds climbing the air is quite an extraordinary image. The metaphor of them scaling the air, not flying through it, but climbing up it and conquering it almost. And again, we have this very rich sound patterning that exists throughout the poem, but I think is particularly strong here. We have the repeated assonance of the sea sounds of cold, companionable, climb. We've got cold, grown, old. The assonance of those O sounds. We've got the alliteration of wonder where they will. And then obviously we've got the rhymes running through all of that as well. We've got still repeated twice within the stanza. So we've got internal rhyme, we've got end rhyme. Very rich sound landscape, which I think contributes to this sense of activity, this sense of energy that the Swans have, that contrasts with Yeats himself. And again, lots of pairings as well. Lover by lover, using that construction to enforce the fact that they're in their pairs. Unwearied as they are. And yeah, there we have that same synecdoche as well. Their hearts have not grown old, in the same way that his heart is sore. We've got both a link between the Swans and Yeats and a contrast in terms of his soreness of heart and their youth of heart. And stillness. So still we've had in the first stanza, mirrors a still sky. Then we have still in the sense of yet in the fourth stanza. But it still recalls the earlier mention of still, and especially as moving on into the final stanza, now they drift upon the still water. Again, we've got this sense of still water, still sky. So still sky comes in the first stanza, still water comes in the last stanza. And that's interesting, again, with this idea of mirroring or pairing. So the mirror of the still sky, well, it's the water, but it's also the sky, and we see them both at the same time. In stanza 1, the still sky is being mirrored. In stanza 5, it's the still water. We have this idea that the two seem to exist together. And it's a beautiful image, and Yeats describes it as such, mysterious, beautiful. This sort of sense of sympathy between the natural landscape and his mood is very strong there. Yeats goes on, having mused on how beautiful it is, to wonder in the final question, when they eventually go, where will they be? So when he awakes one day to find they have flown away, where will they have built their nests? And this is interesting for a number of reasons. I think, firstly, I'm interested in the fact that there's a finality and an inevitability that he says, when I awake someday to find they have flown away, not if. We get the idea that the Swans are a sort of a permanent feature at Coole Park. I read it that Yeats returns to Coole Park to find them each year, not that they return each year to find him. But yet there's the sense that they will inevitably fly away. They will abandon him, they will abandon Coole Park, that there will be a loss inevitably in the future. And I wonder, when looking at this, whether this might be a sense of elegy perhaps that is connected with the death of Lady Gregory's son, who died in the First World War. The poem's written in 1917, shortly after his death. And in fact, a poem in his memory is published in the same collection, The Wild Swans of Coole. And I wonder if this is, in a way, the solace that can be taken from the natural world, this idea that everything will change and decline, and that despite that, when inevitably the birds are lost to the speaker, they will delight other men's eyes somewhere. Maybe there's a sense of comfort in that. It's inconclusive, though. Like so many of Yeats's musings in his poetry, we find a very philosophical openness to the way that he writes about these big questions, and we see that in the questions that he uses, the actual rhetorical or other questions around which he structures his poetry and with which he often concludes his poems. There's no real definite answer that there's a clear or explicit lesson to be learned from the birds. But they do seem to provide an opportunity for the speaker to reflect as the landscape reflects on the passage of time and on possibly the loss of a much loved friend. Okay, so that's, with little in the way of notes, that's one journey through the poem that one could take. Obviously, there's a lot to say about this poem that isn't in there. I mean, I think one of the things that I was interested in looking at it again just now is the trochees in the first stanza. So we start with the iambs of "the trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry," and then we switch to a trochaic meter quite suddenly. "Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky." So again, we've got this switch between lightness in the first two lines and then the weight of the trochee under the October twilight. And maybe that foreshadows the contrasting moods in the poem, the lightness and the energy of the birds, compared with the somberness and the weight of the speaker. What other things in there? Broken rings. You could talk about Yeats's idea of cycles and gyres quite easily. That would be a nice lead in there to suggest that maybe at this time around the First World War that he's thinking about those big movements in history, those changes between ages of progress and ages of destruction. Talk about the idea of freedom. Twilight. I think maybe twilight, you could be looking at the twilight of his life, maybe of European history, of Ireland. Is it just a personal poem, or is it maybe more of a state of the nation poem that he's thinking about politics maybe as well? I mean, I read it as personal, but there's plenty of opportunity here for you to say that he's talking about the personal. He's also talking about the social and the political. Yeah, war also might fit in with that idea of the passional conquest. That's a line that I didn't really look at. That kind of interesting, quite unexpected idea at the end of the penultimate stanza: passional conquest, wonder where they will attend upon them still. What's swans got to do with passional conquest? They seem uniquely human qualities. And what's that about? Conquest written at a time of war. Yeah, could very easily suggest that. Maybe make a link at the end. Again, we're talking about birds. We're talking about birds delighting men's eyes. You could make a link with sailing to Byzantium if you had time. So loads to say about this poem. Loads of points that I didn't make. Swans as well. I haven't even really looked at what swans represent. The idea of beauty, vitality, elegance, grace, but also potency and power. The association with the aristocracy as well. The very regal, noble sort of birds, often to be found in grand houses, and we know that Yeats was partial to spending time with aristocrats. So hopefully that's given you some idea of what you could do when you were talking about the wild swans at Coole. Any thoughts, any questions, any disagreement with my reading of the poem, or any queries about how I went about structuring that commentary, then please, by all means, drop me a line. Thanks, guys. See you soon.